Hi friends, I appreciate you giving me a few minutes of your time out of your busy schedules to connect with me today. I do appreciate it. So you know that we're in the series that we're calling we're calling healthy habits, and we're talking about spiritual disciplines that really help us to be the best version of ourselves. Spiritual disciplines or healthy habits that really allow the beautiful image of God that's within us to emerge as we adopt, these habits. And in other words, how do we create a fertile environment within us to allow the fruit of the Spirit to grow? Love, joy, peace, all of those things. Well, today we're talking about service. This is chapter 9 of Richard J. Foster's book, Celebration of Discipline. And I got to be honest that if you were to just ask me, what are some spiritual disciplines that you could think of kind of off the top of your head? I would quickly go to prayer, Bible reading, mindfulness, those kinds of things. But I wouldn't automatically think of service as, a spiritual discipline that will really help me to grow, right? But Richard J. Foster really helped to reframe this discussion kind of in my mind as I've been thinking about it this week. So as I began thinking about it this week, my mind initially went to service, things that we do, things that we have, places, ways that we can help, places that we can help people, right? Things that we tangibly do for each other. But Richard J. Foster really helped me to see that this is an internal thing. It's an internal posture before it's an external act, right? Internal posture before it's an external act. And let me read for you from page 135 of Celebration of Discipline. He said that service is not a list of things that we do, though in it we discover things to do. It's not a code of ethics, but a way of living. Did you get that? It's not a list of things that we do, although in it we discover things to do. It's not a code of ethics, but a way of living. To do specific acts of service is not the same thing as living in the discipline of service. And so the question today will be, how can we posture ourselves internally as a servant? And then naturally that will flow out of us to serve people, right? What kind of an internal posture can we take? Well, I think that the best person, this is no surprise, the best person to look at is Jesus, right? And I think that there's no better example of service than what we find in John chapter 13. John chapter 13, before we read it, Jesus is coming to the end of his life here on earth, exactly. Of course, he's God, right? And he didn't actually die. His physical body died, but spoiler alert. But, Jesus is coming to the end of his earthly life. And he already knows that Judas, we're going to read, that Judas has agreed to betray him. And so he comes to his last Passover meal with his disciples. And this is where we pick it up in verse 1. Before the Passover celebration, Jesus knew that his hour had come to leave this world and return to his Father. He had loved his disciples, key word, he had loved his disciples during his ministry on earth, and now he loved them to the very end. It was time for supper, and the devil had already prompted Judas, son of Simon Iscariot, to betray Jesus. Jesus knew, this is another key thing we're going to talk about, Jesus knew that the Father had given him authority over everything, and that he had come from God and would return to God. And so, as a result, he got up from the table, took off his robe, wrapped a towel around his waist, and poured water into a basin. Then he began to wash the disciples' feet, drying them with the towel he had around him. Okay, so the question again is, what kind of an internal posture can we adopt before we actually do things for people, right? I see three really important things here that I see in the life of Jesus that I'd like to highlight. The first thing that I see is found in verse 3. And the first thing that I see is strength. Strength. It's really significant that in verse 3, it says that Jesus knew that the Father had given him authority over everything, right? Jesus was not coming from a position of weakness. He knew that he had all authority, that the Father had given him over everything, and that he had come from God and would return to God, right? So Jesus is clearly coming from a position of strength here. This is not a position of weakness. And to have a servant's heart is not a position of weakness, but in fact a position of strength. Friends, there's a difference between, quite often we think of a servant, I don't know, maybe in a paid position or kind of, maybe in a paid position where I'm lower than you in the structure of things. I'm lower than you in the pay kind of scale, or you've hired me to do something, so I'm lower than you, and therefore I have to serve you this food, because if I don't, I'm going to get fired, right? And then I won't be able to pay the bills, kind of thing. I have to do this for you because I'm lower than you. But this is not at all what we're talking about here in this position, in this internal posture of a servant, right? Jesus was coming from a position of strength. And in the structure of things, of course, he's coming from the top, the Father has given him all authority, and therefore he lowered himself, right? So the first thing that we need to do away with in our minds, or maybe to recalibrate our minds, is to understand that service comes from a position of strength, And we could talk, maybe on Sunday we'll talk a little bit about boundaries, because, well, let me just say really quickly that there was something that I didn't actually agree with in Richard J. Foster's book, and we'll talk more about it on Sunday. But I think that it's important to have boundaries around service, so that you know what, I better move on. Come on Sunday if you want to talk more about boundaries and positions of strength, so that we don't actually enable behavior. But anyways, I'm going to move on, okay? So the first thing I see here in verse 3 is that true service, a heart of service, internal posturing of a servant, comes from a place of strength. The second thing that I see is in verse 1, that Jesus loved his disciples during his ministry on earth, and now he loved them to the very end. Love, friends, love is everything when we're talking about taking the position of a servant. If Jesus didn't love his disciples, right, then he wouldn't have humbled himself. We'll get to that in just a moment. But love is absolutely important. I was thinking about something this week, that back before COVID, maybe 3 or 4 years ago or something, we brought a group of our Heisey Hillers to Rouge Valley Mennonite Church, and we helped with a ministry called Out of the Cold. And there are homeless, mainly men. There were a couple of women, but homeless people who met at bus stations, and they hopped on the bus and they came and were fed at different churches around the York region on different nights of the week. And on a particular night, we had the privilege of serving some of our friends, a nice hot meal. And I was thinking about this because, for me, it was one thing to do the work to prepare the food and to dish the food and to hand out a plate of food, right? That's service. But it took an entirely different meaning when after we had served the food, we got ourselves a plate and we sat down at the table, around the table with our new friends, right? And we took the posture of friendship. We took the posture of love and relationships. And that whole thing changed for me when it went from just, here's a plate of food, stranger, to, hi, John, whatever. Hi, John, how was your week? How are you doing? Here's some food for, do you know what I mean? Like, it's entirely different when your friend's name, when you view them as a friend, and when you view it from a position of love. Love, friends, is the key to moving from here's a plate of food to taking the heart of a servant. Okay, I need to move along. But Jesus showed, that he loved his disciples, and therefore, in verse 4, therefore, so he got up from the table, took off his robe, wrapped a towel around his waist, poured water into the basin, and washed his disciples' feet. And of course, we know that washing disciples' feet was a very practical thing that needed to be done, just like serving food was a very practical thing that needed to be done. But because of love and from a position of strength, Jesus humbled himself. Now there's a key word, humble, humility. Friends, humility in serving is absolutely essential. Love and humility are two essential ingredients to taking the heart of a servant. I really liked something that Richard J. Foster talked about in his book. He talked about how doing acts of service without having a heart of humility can lead to self-righteous pride. Doing acts of service without having a heart of humility can lead to self-righteous pride. And he goes on in different sections, and I've just captured kind of the summary, the first line maybe of each section. But, he talks about self-righteous service likes to be seen, right? Self-righteous service loves the big screen, right? Or it loves the social media. Here I am serving, kind of thing. And self-righteous service loves to be seen. It loves the big stage, loves social media. He didn't, of course, he wrote it 45 years ago. It wasn't no social media then. But anyways, another thing he said, self-righteous service requires external rewards. Self-righteous service requires external rewards. I need to have some kind of feedback, some kind of reward for doing it. Self-righteous service is concerned about results, right? Isn't that interesting? Self-righteous service is concerned about results instead of just serving, just because I'm serving, right? And one other thing he said, self-righteous service picks and chooses whom to serve. It picks and chooses whom to serve. Isn't that interesting? In fact, we see that in John 13, that Judas had already agreed to betray Jesus, right? So if there was any kind of self-righteous or self-serving service in Jesus, he would have said, yeah, not so fast, Judas. You know what I mean? And I would totally be tempted to do that. I would serve everybody else in the room and be, yeah, like Judas, just go ahead and leave now, because I know, you know what I mean? But Jesus served him. He washed his feet and he loved him, right? He loved the one that would betray him. Wow, that speaks volumes to me. And maybe on Sunday we'll be able to talk more about this. Okay, I need to move along. So then going on in John 13, it says, after washing their feet, he put on his robe again, sat down and asked, do you understand what I was doing? You call me teacher and Lord, and you're right, because that's what I am. And since I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you ought to wash each other's feet. Or you, in more modern terms, you need to serve each other. I have given you an example to follow. Do as I have done. Can I throw in one more scripture? Galatians chapter 5, verse 13 is such a succinct and powerful statement from Paul. Serve one another in love. There it is. Serve one another in love. So now we get to the practical side. All of that has been the internal posture, but now we get to the practical side of what could we do this week that would actually serve somebody in a meaningful way. Well, when I see these words in Galatians 5:13, serve one another in love, my mind goes back to a book that Gary Chapman wrote years ago called Love Languages. And the book was originally written kind of for marriage relationships. And the general idea was that different people kind of receive love in different ways. For some people, it's words of affirmation that are really meaningful to them. For other people, it's acts of service that are meaningful to them. For some people, it's receiving gifts. For other people, it's quality time, just spending time together. Kathy one of her love languages is quality time. We don't have to be doing anything, but just to be together. And then the fifth love language is personal touch. Maybe just taking a hand of somebody, or maybe lovingly putting your hand on their shoulder, but personal touch, right? And of course, respecting people's boundaries. But so when you think about these love languages, what are ways that are meaningful to you personally to receive love? Is it words of affirmation? Is it acts of service, receiving gifts, quality time, personal touch? What's meaningful for you? But here's the important question for our topic today. What's meaningful to the people around you? Are you in tune enough with the people around you, not assuming that the way that you like to receive love is the way that they like to receive love, but are you in tune enough to the people around you to understand what is their love language and how can you show them love? In other words, how can you serve them this week? So maybe for somebody that's feeling just a little lonely, or they just, maybe quality time is their love language. Maybe just getting together for coffee, either inviting them to your house or saying, let's go to the bakehouse or whatever, or Red Bulb or whatever. But let's just spend some time together, right? Go for a walk or something. Or for other people, it's words of affirmation. They just need to hear, well done. Or I appreciate you for this, or whatever. Words of affirmation. Maybe somebody around you needs to just hear that kind of encouragement, or maybe there's some kind of an act of service that you can do for somebody. My point is, friends, that what would it be like if this week we were a little more in tune with the people around us and ways that people, that we can serve people, that we can actively love people. Okay? So I hope that maybe this will make a difference. I hope that maybe there's faith for you. I hope that maybe this will make a difference for you. And maybe as we give some thought to this week, that we'll be able to just serve each other, the people around us, right? So trust you have a fantastic day. Thanks again for connecting with me.